we're not quite at 5:15, but go ahead and launch a little bit. Well, welcome. Glad to see so many of you. Hope you are all enjoying your introduction weekend to Georgetown. This is just the start of my second year here, so I'm relatively new here. This is the first time I've done this kind of thing. Well, I've done this kind of thing a lot, but not for parents. Usually it's for either faculty or students. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is borrowed and stolen from others, but that's what we do in academics, right? The best thing ever. What do they say? Good writers borrow from other writers. Great writers steal outright. Fortunately, what we're going to be talking about today is an area of, part of my area of expertise. I'm a cognitive psychologist by training. I have a PhD in cognition and cognitive neuroscience. And a great part of the focus of my current research is in the science of teaching and learning. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, the reason I titled this talk, Learning How to Learn, is it turns out most of us don't really know how to learn. We think we know how to learn. So the first thing you have to realize is you probably have to throw away everything you think you know about learning. How many of you have been taught or taught others that the best thing you can do is repeat things over and over again? Like drill it in, reread your notes, a lot of that. Well, we're going to try to set that aside here in a minute. I'm going to show you a demonstration about how I think that is not as effective as you might think. But first, I want to show you this quick kind of introductory video from Mark McDaniel. Mark's a good friend of mine. Come on. Good friend and colleague. He's got this terrific book out along with Roddy Rodiger and somebody else I don't know who actually wrote the whole thing. It's called Make It Stick. And it's a really terrific book that kind of takes all of this, does it in a very approachable way. So they brought in a novelist. That's the guy I don't know. But Roddy and Mark are really terrific scientists. And so this is a quick introduction about why learning to learn is important.
Our educational situation sets up a very funny paradox. And it's this, that we throw the student into the classroom and we expect them to know how to learn. We don't give them any training on how to learn. We don't teach them how to learn, yet we expect them to learn. We expect everybody's going to thrive. The paradox is this. We would never do this for any kind of skill. You would never throw your child into a swimming pool, into the deep end of the swimming pool, and say, swim, learn to swim. Because what would happen is most of the children would drown. And we wouldn't do this with a piano. You wouldn't sit your child in front of a piano and say, play. Learn to play the classical music. No, they're given lessons on how to play. Yet this is what we do in schools. We throw the kids into the classroom and say, learn, figure out how to learn. Like the assumption is that learning is intuitive. It isn't. And we can teach students the skills for how to learn. And I think if we do that, then we will find that we're going to see improvements in education. And we're going to see students who like to learn, feel comfortable with learning, and are going to not become dissatisfied and disenchanted with school.
So that's one of the things I think that's really important is that we really do have to think of learning as a skill. When I talk to my students, when I teach intro psych, for example, the first day I do a whole hour and somewhat, 75 minutes, however long our class periods are, on this particular topic. Because most of them are new. Come on. Most of them are new. Not all of them have been to, they've obviously not been to college before. Not everyone comes from a family of people who have gone to college, and not everyone knows how to learn. So I think it's really important. And so what I tell them is you wouldn't show up to a football game without having gone to practice. You wouldn't show up to recital without having practice. So it's the same thing with an exam. You have to practice. You have to practice just like you would any other skill. And so learning's a whole skill on its own. So we're going to, I'm going to dust across a lot of these things. We could spend an entire couple of days talking about these issues. But I'll talk about sort of hit the favorites. I'm going to talk about how learning is misunderstood. Talk about to learn, you should retrieve. That is, retrieval practice is a really important thing to try to do. We know from neuroscience that whenever you retrieve a memory, you create a new memory. And so it strengthens that memory. We'll talk about what's called mixing it up. Rather than studying all at once, mixing up different ways in which you study and places in which you study. We'll talk about desirable difficulties, illusions of knowing, and then finally the myth of learning style. So we're going to do all that in about 40 minutes. So like I said, we're going to skip across this pretty quickly. So we often engage And students often engage in the least effective memory strategies because they feel like they work. That is, we feel like we're learning, and so we engage in those things the most often. In fact, repetition is one of the least effective memory strategies. It doesn't mean it doesn't work, but it doesn't mean there are also better ways. And we want our learners to be better because we want them to do things more easily. So what I want you guys to get out of this is when your student who's new here calls and says, oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen. How do I get through this material? You can provide them with a few tips here and there. And then you guys will hopefully take something for your own daily lives as well. So repetition, like I said, is one of the least effective strategies. Make sure you don't have your iPhone out because it's going to be important here in a second. So put it away so you can't see the Apple logo.
Excuse me, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt you, but it's like I always learned that repetition was great, and I'm kind of going, for example, if you want to learn how to kick a ball, you go to the field and kick and kick and kick, and the repetition will make you learn it better, right?
There's a difference between a motor skill and learning knowledge. But yeah, repetition actually, it works, but there are far more effective strategies.
Okay.
Yeah, this is one of those things that it's very hard to get people out of because it feels like you should know it. So how many times a day do you think you see the Apple logo? Okay, probably 1,000, right? Okay. How confident are you that you would be able to draw the Apple logo from memory? Feels like fairly confident, right?
Yeah.
How about recognizing the correct logo? Think you could do that? All right. Is it this one? That one? That one? That one? Maybe this one? Maybe it's that one. Maybe it's this one. Which one of these is it? Now, if you see the Apple logo 1,000 times a day and repetition is an effective strategy, this ought to be the easiest thing you've ever done. But it turns out it is B. It is B. Now the problem is, of course, it's not a very fair test because I didn't ask you to sit down and memorize the Apple logo, right? But if just simply repeatedly exposing yourself to something, sounds kind of dirty, I'm sorry, repeatedly exposing yourself to material, looking at material is an effective strategy, we should all know what the Apple logo looks like to be able to draw, well, those of us who remember cash should be able to know what's on the cash. This is some of the examples I use. What hand the Statue of Liberty holds her torch in. These are all things that you can convince yourself. I can convince myself it's both the right and left. And every time I use this as an example in class, somebody has to look it up because none of us can figure it out. It is the right hand, I think. The point being is that in the experiment that I got this from, and I have to thank Alan Castle for providing these materials for me, 1 out of 85 participants could actually draw the Apple logo correctly from memory. Only about half the participants could correctly choose the logo, which is above chance, right? Because there was, 8 possibilities, so chance would be, 12%? So it's, better than chance, but only half. That's pretty low considering how pervasive the Apple logo is. I can be teaching class and look at, 45 Apple laptops that are open, and I couldn't tell you what it looks like. So participants were very confident that they would be able to complete this particular task, but in fact, they were terrible at it. So why is that? Well, again, repetition, we have this feeling like we know things. We call it a feeling of knowing. Yeah. So we have a feeling like we have learned something. So when we repeatedly read material, it's fresh in our minds, so it feels like it was easier to learn that second time, but that's an illusion.
I'm going to get there, but
Come on in.
sorry.
That's all right. So one of the ways in which we can do this that's more effective than repetition is engage in retrieval practice. And this is what we call the testing effect. So this is not the best copy of this study, but basically in this experiment what the investigators did is they had participants study twice or get a single test. So these participants studied material and then they got a chance to study it again. These participants studied, then took a test, and then everybody took a test after that. You can see 5 minutes later, the repeated study condition does a little bit better. So if it's right before the exam, Hail Mary pass, breathe through your notes again, right? 2 days later, dramatic improvement in learning for the group that had a single test. And a week later, it's about a 50% improvement in memory for one test versus a single rereading. So this is a really effective way to get things into memory, is by retrieving them from memory. Again, we call this engaging in retrieval practice. So testing is a really important way in which we do this. Now, tests have gotten a bad rap, right? Too much testing, and I agree, too much bad testing is occurring in schools. But tests that demonstrate mastery, that allow students to retrieve information from memory, are actually good for them. In fact, in my classes, every class has some sort of weekly memory exercise. Usually it's a weekly quiz they either do online, or I've used apps, and I'm trying lots of different technology. My PhD advisor just introduced, I was at a conference this August. He does this learning for mastery. His students have to take a quiz until they get every answer correct. The trick is for each concept, the website changes the questions every time, so it's not like they can memorize the questions and the answers. And he's reported really great results in long-term learning. So tests are really learning opportunities. They're not just ways in which we can assess students' learning. So testing is superior to restudying. It works with a variety of types of tests. Students have gotten pretty good at this. I've discovered students use things like Quizlet. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It's an important new learning tool. The problem is they tend to write pretty bad quiz questions. That is, they don't write ones that really make them think about what the material is, because they're not going to write a hard question themselves. But I, fortunately, am very good at writing pretty good questions, and I can write them very quickly. So I tend to provide them with lots of test material they can take themselves. Most textbooks have review questions in the back of the chapter, or they have study guides that can come along with that. And again, it doesn't matter what type of test we're talking about, you do get long-term improvements in memory. The more effort that's required for memory, the better learning is. So those short-term or short answer essay kinds of questions, what we would call a free recall kind of task, does in fact result in the highest levels of learning. But it works with multiple choice. It even works with open book exams. And if you think about your approach to taking an open book exam, what would you do? You don't look up the answer first, right? You try to answer it, and then if you can't find the answer, you go look it up or you confirm your answer. So it's still a memory task. It's that retrieval from memory that's the important part of that. So another key thing to students when they're getting tested is they need feedback. And again, this is where I need your help, is you got to get your kids to go get their exams from their professors if they don't hand them back. I hand all my exams back. I write new ones every semester. I don't care how many questions there are out in the world. But not every professor's like that. My colleagues here seem to embrace this quite a bit. When I was at a previous university, I kept getting this, and I would have to write new exam questions, and I thought, it's kind of a job. But call me crazy. So providing that feedback is really important, because one of the things that happens is you answer a question, and if you're not sure of the answer, then your memory becomes unsure as well. And so providing accurate feedback for people to answer a question correctly boosts their confidence in that memory. And of course, then we also get the ability to correct any incorrect responses. So I always tell my students, go through the exam, try to figure out your mistakes, which I usually regret about 3 days later, because then I have a line of students out trying to argue with their grades. But that's what they're supposed to do. So I encourage that. So go get those exams, have them look over, try to learn from those mistakes, try to make sure they get that kind of feedback. Spacing out testing, we're going to talk about what's called the spacing effect here in a second, is another important thing. So not just doing a bunch of review tests the day before the exam. None of your kids would do that, I'm sure. My students are all perfect too. None of them do this. So spacing it out really does dramatically improve performance, and Jeff Karpicki's shown that. Another thing that Jeff's shown is that students don't tend to test themselves. This isn't a strategy that students engage in very often, although it's changing a bit as this becomes a more popular type of study strategy. One of the things that happens, and one of the things I as an instructor, and you guys can do as well, is we have to battle with what we call this illusion of competence. As you remember being in school, you ever shown up for that exam, do this, and then you've got nothing. Right? You thought you knew it really well, but somehow it escaped you overnight. Well, that happens a lot of times when we're studying because, again, we get this, oh, this is easy, I understand this, because they're trying to use this kind of what we call heuristic strategy, where they're just gauging how easy it is to learn or not whether they've actually learned it or not. And so that's one of the important things that we need to fight against is this repeated reading of material. If they're engaged in the material, if they're thinking about it, if they're interacting with the material in ways, thinking of their own examples, trying to apply it, that's an effective strategy. But that highlighting and skimming, and that, of course, your students would never do. I'm talking to the wrong group, right? But we all did this as students. I know I did. It's just not a very good strategy. And one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute is what really seems to matter is effort. That is, anything that is easy is probably too easy. And so I want to talk about that here in just a minute. We'll talk about mixing it up next. So testing is important. It's a good strategy. Mixing it up has to do with really essentially the order in which your students study. And we call this space versus mass study. Mass study is studying all at once, one long study session cramming. Spacing your study out is where you've studied a little bit over time. And for centuries, this has been a well-established phenomenon, going back to Ebbinghaus in the late 19th century. So this is one of the oldest and most robust findings. We often call this interleaved study as well. One of the other things that the research shows is that in a single study session, if you kind of switch from one topic to the other, or one type of problem to the other, you'll actually improve learning pretty dramatically. And this is one of those things that feels like the wrong thing to do. And that's, again, one of the things sometimes we have to battle with. So spacing out that studying. And so, to give you an example, 15 minutes a day for 4 days is far more effective than 1 hour on one day. That spacing out studying really does dramatically benefit learning. So to give you some examples, there's a longer list. I had to cull this down for time purposes. So I wanted to have lots of time for questions at the end.
So sorry.
Yeah.
So when you were saying switch from one to the other, for example, switch from studying maths to studying chemistry,
Right, something like that, or even just simply switching up within a topic. So to give you an example, in art classes, one of the things they often do is they say, well, here are all of Monet's paintings, and here are all of Manet's paintings, and somehow they're supposed to tell the difference between the two. We're going to exhaust my knowledge of art very quickly. So they tend to block them all together. What's actually a better practice, which Nick Cornell and Bob York found, is that if you mix up the order of artists, basically shuffle the deck and have them learn one painting from one artist and another painting from the next, what they learn is the differences between the two. And you've also created this whole sort of new context. So that's artist paintings. Mathematics, every math book, there is one math book available that does not do this. Every math book on the planet except for one does this. In the problem section, there are 5 problems of type A, there's 5 problems of type B, there's 5 problems of type C. And so what students who are going through those practice problems do is they discover the solution to the first problem, and then they apply it 5 more times. Whereas if you shuffle the deck and have them do them in random order, each time they're presented with a problem, they have to figure out the solution to that problem. And so it engages them much more deeply in the material, again, because they're learning how to apply the material in different contexts and in different ways. And so by mixing up the deck a little bit, you get some pretty significant advantages. You get similar things with identifying animal species. And my favorite example is in learning piano melodies. Anybody who's played an instrument or been in a chorus or a band, there is a standard way in which rehearsal is conducted. You play the same piece or sing the same piece 30 times in a row, right? Until everyone feels like they've got it, and then they go on to the next one. And then everyone comes back the next week. I was in a chorus in South Carolina. Everyone comes back the next week having learned nothing the previous week, right? Yet we love feeling like we all knew that one song, and so you already ended with learning none of them. A better way to do this, and this is where we start to get into this fighting against what feels easier and not. So when you're playing a piano melody, what's happening is you're basically executing a motor plan, right? And because you've just executed that motor plan, it's fresh, and you can do it again. It doesn't mean you've learned it. It just means that pathway's been primed, so you can do it very quickly and very easily the next time. But that doesn't mean you've actually learned it. It means that it was just easier to do that time. And so a week later, you won't have learned it. you've just simply fallen into this illusion of competence because it felt like you knew what you were doing because it felt easier. So much better is to play one piece, then switch to a different one, and then switch to a different one, and come back again, which feels wrong. Does it not feel like the wrong way to do it? But it's actually a better way to learn. Yeah?
So when you talk about singing, is that the same, is that considered murder as well?
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing because you're executing, you're constricting your voice and doing all that. Of course, there's also, singing has a more memory component to it because you have lyrics. It's a whole more complicated thing to try to do versus just moving from one note to the other. To me, singing's easy. I could never play the piano. I'm way too uncoordinated. But yeah, that's a much more memory component to it as well. It's all memory. Some of it's different kinds of memory. At the end of the day, what the problem with math studying is that is studying all at once is you get this metacognitive illusion. So we get this what we call illusion of competence, and we call this an ease of acquisition heuristic because each time you play or each time you go through your notes, it feels like it's gotten easier and easier each time. But that ease of acquisition is actually an illusion. You're not learning. It's just easier to process each time. Again, unfortunately, this tends to result in little long-term retention. So it's much better to try to mix things up and make it feel harder. And again, this is a hard thing to try to do because it just feels like it's the wrong thing to do. But it is the right thing to do. And so why does this work? Well, we have to understand the relationship between what we call episodic memory and knowledge. Episodic memory is memory for our life's episode. So what you did yesterday, what you had for breakfast, what I talked about 5 minutes ago, that's all episodic memory. Episodic memory becomes our knowledge eventually. You all know George Washington was the first president of the United States, but none of you can tell me when and where you learned that fact, right? You've lost its context. Tomorrow, you'll be at brunch because it's the DC thing to do. El Centro, I highly recommend. I don't get a cut from that. So it's El Centro, it's $35, all you can eat and drink. In 2 hours. They only give you 2 hours. You can't sit there all day. It's good food, good mimosas, good time. Anyway, so you're sitting at brunch tomorrow. You'll remember this or a little bit of it, and then 10 years from now you'll remember some weird factoid that I came up with, like the Apple logo, and forget that you were ever here. That's because you have lost the episode but kept the knowledge. So our goal for our students is to get that knowledge. So we want things to become independent of their context. Episodic memory is also what we call context-dependent learning. So it's linked to specific times and places. So by mixing things up, we create different contexts. So as a result, when students go to remember something, it's less dependent on its original learning context. We know that early on, episodic memory supports knowledge, so that as people rely on that original context. But eventually, it starts to become independent of that. And so by mixing up order, mixing up where they study, one of the other myths about learning is you should have one place where you always study. Anyone have that? Yeah, that's a common myth. Terrible idea. The more places that you engage in material, the more context that you learn in, the less dependent on that context. Because they're not taking my exam at home in their safe space, right? It's the same thing I tell people. Fortunately, I have almost no students that smoke anymore. But back when I did, I always told them make sure that they had nicotine beforehand because nicotine has a highly state-dependent effect on learning. So does caffeine. They can't smoke in my classroom. They can drink all the coffee they want. But it gets back to this idea of context. And so the fewer contexts you have, the more dependent it becomes. And so I tell them, go find places that you like to study. Put on your earbuds, go sit outside, go to Starbucks, go to the library. Wherever works for you is going to be the way to do it. So spacing results in these kind of multiple contexts and allows us to learn things independent of their context. So the next, I think, really, this is, I think, gets at a lot of what I'm trying to emphasize here today, is this idea of what we call desirable difficulties. And the basic idea is we want material to be engaging and difficult without being frustrating. It's kind of like trying to find that sweet spot. In psychology, we have this thing called the Yerkes-Dodson effect. I'll talk about that in a second. But learning that requires effort is generally superior to that requires no effort, which again is somewhat counterintuitive because students feel like it was easy, it should be easier to learn. It's actually not. So this is what we call the Yerkes-Dodson effect. You better remember this from their psychology classes. This idea is that the more motivated you are, that is your level of arousal, you'll do better until it gets to the point where you're too stressed. So this is kind of a measure of stress. So if you're too, you just kind of, your performance isn't going to be very good. So you have this kind of sweet spot where you've got enough motivation to do well, but not to the point where you're freaking out, right? It's the same thing with learning. That is, there has to be this point where it's engaging and difficult, but not frustrating. When I teach statistics, students have this tendency to focus on the most difficult material. And as a result, they don't get any of the material that they could have if they'd have forgotten about that one really hard thing. This is one of those things. One of my philosophies in life is whenever you do something, you have to pick one thing you won't do. Like I do this when I go on vacation. We're going to do all these things, and you'll never get to them, so you have to figure out which one's going to be a loser, right? Same thing when you plan parties. Anyone do this? They get through like, I'm going to cook all this stuff, and then the day of, you're like, nope, nope. That's life. You got to do the same thing. So when it comes to things like statistics, people forget that learning is like other things. You can't walk into a gym and bench press 400 pounds on the first day. You can't walk into a yoga class and stick your foot behind your head on the first day. You're going to break something. It's the same thing with statistics. You can't focus on that hard thing because you may never get it. And there might be one question on the exam about 2x2 factor analysis or whatever it is that you're focused on, freaking out about, when you could have gotten all this other stuff by starting simply, building on that knowledge, stretching a little bit, getting engaged, getting more comfortable. That's a really important lesson. So we call this trying to get into the zone, or what we call the region of proximal learning. Love psychology. We have two names for everything. I really wish that wasn't true, but as a cognitive psychologist, I can tell you everything I teach has two different names. So the region of proximal learning and desirable difficulties is basically two sides of the same coin. So understanding what you already know and understanding is crucial. This is an important part of what we do. That is, you have to figure out what you know, figure out what you don't know, and go from there. So we get back to testing. By testing yourself, or your students having your students test themselves, they can figure out what they need to know and what they don't need to know. I always tell the story. I had this incredibly difficult sensation of perception class, and so I write notes and outlines. You might have noticed I teach in an outline, and so I made myself memorize the entire outline of all my notes, and I would write them from memory and then see what I'd forgotten. This is the reason I'm here. A really effective strategy, because then you know, well, this is all the stuff I don't know yet, so I need to study that more. So building on what you know and focusing on what's just beyond your current skill level is really important. This is another good life strategy, I know. Hopefully you guys are trying out new things as adults. Me, I'm learning how to bake. I never did. I've always been a really good cook, but I never baked before, and it's a whole different thing. But I didn't start with something incredibly difficult, right? You don't start with souffles. Because that's an exercise in futility. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how to do hollandaise sauce. It's one of the other cooking things I haven't figured out yet. If anyone has a good secret, let me know. Yeah. It's great. I'm just have to buy 47 dozen eggs and sit and do it at home until I get it right. Okay, so that's desirable difficulties. Any of your kids take my class, they'll discover that I can wander off topic very quickly. So metacognition is a big fancy word for knowing what you know, or analyzing your own memory. And you're all trying to figure out why Donald Rumsfeld is here. Well, Donald Rumsfeld has the best quote about metamemory that's not about metamemory. This is great. I lived in D.C. when he was Secretary of Defense. There are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know that we don't know. And then my favorite part of this that makes it art. There are also unknowns that are things we don't know that we don't know. The Dada-esque quality of the paragraph aside, he's actually onto something here. When it comes to metacognition, we oftentimes don't know what we haven't learned. And we don't know what we have learned. You can go to Eastern philosophy to get a nice fortune cookie size of the same quote. Wise man knows what he does not know. So that's what we get at when we talk about metacognition, is trying to do knowledge and awareness of our own cognitive processes and memory. That's what we talk about when we talk about metamemory. So how do we know what's in our memories? And it turns out we're terrible at this. That is, we are terrible at trying to figure out what we're going to remember later. And we've all had that experience, right, where you think you're going to learn something. It's names for me. I'm going to remember this person's name. I really am. No, not going to happen. And names are hard. It's because usually no one ever gets introduced single file, one person at a time, and then give you 10 minutes to remember their name. This is Bob, Larry, Joe, Susie, Steve, Dave, and you, I don't know. And it just kind of flies right by you. And so that's one of the things that makes them difficult. But understanding that and knowing that is really important. So again, when we talk about studying meta memory, we talk about doing what we call predicting later memory performance. It's called the judgment of learning. Tell me how likely you are to remember this later. I've actually started doing this in my classes a little bit in terms of exam performance. I actually had done this with the topic. This was when I was still at Clemson. And I discovered that all the students who rated that they understood the action potential as a 10, they all got the answer wrong on the quiz. And what I think happened is in class they said, oh, I understand this, and rated it as a 10, and then didn't study it again because they had rated it as a 10 in class. So I stopped doing that with this kind of thing. But again, we all fall prey to what we call these metacognitive illusions. And so I want to quickly show you what this kind of looks like. This is from Alan Castle's work. So this is a pretty typical kind of what cognitive psychologists love word lists because they're nice and clean and neat. So we have people, how likely are you to remember the word bird, or how likely are you to remember the word dog? They rate bird as easier to remember later. And it turns out there's very little difference between these two. Bird just feels like it's easier because it's big and old. We feel like it's gonna be later. Now, when we get to horse and canary, they rank canary as being easy to remember, but horse is actually more likely to be remembered. Why? How much effort did it take you to figure out what that said? It gets back to that question of difficulty. If it's a little bit difficult, you're more likely to remember it later. And so again, it's this illusion we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to print notes in weird, crazy font, nor do I think they should be. But sometimes I think we set students up a little bit. Textbooks with all that bold print, they fall prey to thinking that's going to be easy to remember because it's in bold. Highlighters. Highlighters are really good for finding stuff later, and that's what I use them for when I read academic papers. I want to find this quote later. But they're terrible because when your students go look through their notes, they highlighted it and it stands out to them, but it doesn't do anything to their memory. So again, we all stink at this, and there's lots of different ways this shows up. Shannon Carpenter, that paper's got to be out by now, has this really brilliant study where she had students do 2 different lectures. It's something about cats. And one's all disjointed and crazy and out of order, and the other one's nice and perfect and fluent, like me. Kidding. But what she found is the students remembered the not very well put together lecture better and rated the other one as easier. And one of the things that happens is when you have professors who are engaging and interesting, oftentimes students think they're going to remember it later because they're so interested at the time, but then they haven't taken good notes. They should be taking handwritten notes, by the way. I didn't include that in here, but there's a whole bunch of new papers that have just come out that indicate handwritten notes result in much better memory than typed notes.
What about
What's that?
Versus
typed, yeah.
What about hearing and audio? Taping.
Yeah, that's some people still do that. I have started lecture capturing mine so they can actually watch the videos online again. Not all of them, but I'm trying to do it more and more so that they can go. I do talk a little fast. I know that. That allows them to kind of go back through and pause things. And I put my PowerPoint slides up and kind of give them everything they need. But that handwritten notes actually really does help. And again, it's about, and I was thinking about this earlier today, the reason handwritten notes are different from typing is a single letter exercise, right? You type one letter at a time versus you write one word at a time. You don't write one letter, you think about the entire word. It's just a different way in which we engage with the material. Yeah.
So then with now printing, do they print versus
cursive? That I don't know because I print too because I can't read cursive. I can't read by cursive. I mean, I can write cursive, but not very well. But I can print really fast. But again, they're usually processing whole word versus single letters because, it's this kind of thing which has nothing to do with the letters themselves but which finger you're using, whereas when you're writing out, you have to figure out the shape of the letter, all that. There's a whole lot more to it. So how do we improve meta memory? Well, we get right back to where we were, is you have to evaluate your learning, and one of the best ways to do that is through self-testing. So last couple things I want to finish up, and then I want to give you guys some time for questions about different things I have a chance to talk about. Again, I tried to kind of dust across what I think the greatest hits here are. I want to finish up with what we call the myth of learning styles. There's a group of us who are determined. There is no evidence that students have different learning styles. Pretty much one brain's like another. Not everyone's entirely the same. What there often are different learning preferences. And this is a really important distinction because what students prefer is not necessarily what's going to be better for them. That is, they're not necessarily going to remember more, as we've seen from the metacognitive literature. That is, things that students find easy oftentimes are the wrong strategies. And sometimes the wrong strategy is used for the wrong kind of material. So, how many of you are familiar with concept maps? Your kids been doing these at all? Yeah, it kind of is a thing that is breezed through, and I think it's kind of blown right past. It's one of those things that's probably pretty good for structuring, say, an essay, but it's terrible for a multiple choice question exam. So when kids go to take things like Mark McDaniel, who you saw at the beginning, he's looked at the AP exams and the relationship between the concept maps used in the AP classes versus the AP exam, and they're not good. The ways in which they engage the material are completely different. And so it's one of those things we really have to do and get into, and this is our current thinking, is evidence-based study practices. And that's everything I provided here today has a lot of evidence behind it. I wouldn't stand up here and talk about it if I wasn't very confident. A lot of this stuff has over 100 years of research behind it. Unfortunately, the education community is often a little bit behind in terms of what is best and what's not, and so we try to do that. Well, I wanted to save some time. Again, I've got other things I can talk about, but I'm sure you guys have questions. I also have put some reading, Make It Sticks, Mark and Roddy's book. I don't get a cut from their sales. And then some original research, and then some good links. My YouTube channel, I actually will put this up on YouTube, provided this microphone over here is actually working. So you can actually show it to your kids. I've got a whole bunch of other stuff there as well. I've also put links to Circle and then lastinglearning.com. That's Nate Cornell and Bob Bjork at UCLA have put together this really, really great website. So take a look at that. There's some really good stuff there. This is Mark McDaniel. He's co-director of Circle. It's the Center for Integrated Research in Cognition, Learning, and Education. And then our own candles here. It's pretty good, too. What questions you guys have? I'm sure you have stuff that I haven't talked about. Yeah?
One thing you mentioned was caffeine, versus nicotine. I didn't get what you were saying. Did
So,
it help?
they exhibit what we call a state-dependent effect. So if your students study using caffeine, then they're going to do better on the test if they have some caffeine as well. We try to discourage nicotine use as much as we can. Vaping is, of course, the new thing.
So Dr. Mayer, how are the educators changing their teaching styles? Because if knowing with
we're
here at
working on it.
Georgetown, in particular because the PowerPoint is very passe, and
Yeah.
this whole concept of the flipped classroom where you
Yeah.
have the groups and teach to the matter that the students lack knowledge in, the harder
Yeah.
classes.
There's mixed results on the flipped classrooms, both in terms of whether or not students like them and in terms of whether or not they're actually learning more. A lot of places I've seen students complain that the flipped classroom time is not used well, and so that's a huge concern. My biggest thing is it's often difficult to get students to read the textbook, getting them to watch lectures on top of the textbook outside, because that's what flipped classrooms do, is they watch lectures online, and then they're supposed to engage in other material. I think it works well for things like writing, where they actually have something to do, but I would have, like in my classes, there's nothing I would really be able to do. In my physio class this coming fall, it's physiological psychology, it's neuroanatomy, and it sounds as boring as it is. And I think it's really important for them to know, but I'm also trying to figure out how to spice it up. So I'm actually doing 4 mini seminars. So that week they'll come to class once, and my TA and I will split. So we'll split the class into 2 days. Half will come one day, half will come the other, and we'll split those groups into 2 groups and and do just a mini seminar. I'm going to do neuroeconomics. I try to find something on voting, but that might be neuro decision making. Probably music in the brain and something else. I'm going to do 4 of those. In those weeks, I'll still have to cover material, so they'll have to watch the online lectures for that. But again, this idea to try to get them more engaged. So when you can do it right, I think that's a way to do things. There's this. We are in the middle, sort of a huge revolution. And I want to say, about 15 years ago is when the cognitive psychology community finally started turning their attention really towards trying to develop evidence-based practices. And it's taken off like wildfire, but trying to get it all into what really works, and what works well in the classroom, and what you can actually integrate in the classroom is sort of where we're at now. And so a lot of my colleagues and I are kind of going out and trying to give seminars on how to do weekly quizzes, how to do it well, how to do it easily. People use iClickers. You're familiar with those. I used an app called Top Hat where they could answer quiz questions on their phone. Students reported they didn't like paying for it, so I'm trying to come up with some alternatives. One thing I used in my summer class is called Plickers. I should have brought one. They're these cards that have a code on them, and they can turn the card one of 4 directions to answer A, B, C, or D. And then I just take my cell phone out, and with the camera, it picks up each of their individual codes that's tied to their name. And depending on which way they hold their card, depends on which way they answer. Each card's different, so you can't tell who's answering A, B, or C from behind you, because not everyone's is the same. It's really cool. So I've been using that. The problem is it only works with less than 64 people, because I think it's some mathematical thing with the flickers. So yeah, I've been trying to do that kind of engagement. With Top Hat, I was doing a lot of interactive demonstrations too, which I think is a really important way. So trying to get, it's just getting the word out and getting people to actually, incorporate things into the classroom. Nobody likes change. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Yeah.
Any research on the differences between e-books, textbooks, and printed matter?
There is limited. There doesn't seem to be much difference. One of the biggest problems with e-books is eye strain. That's why I don't. I mean, I'm an old dusty book person. My 74-year-old mother lives with me. She's got a little bit early onset dementia, but she and I are book hoarders, and so we just moved, and that was an ordeal. But there doesn't seem much evidence between them. There are some really good technologies with e-books. So there's I can't remember the name of it. They're at Carnegie Mellon, and they actually have developed these online textbooks. I think it's $10 for the students and free for the instructor, and the instructor can go through and see if they've read it. And then there's like chapter quizzes, and they can go through and see all those, and it's already all built into it. Really pretty cool. I looked at it. I didn't like the textbook, so I haven't adopted it. But Victor Bonassi, who's at University of New Hampshire, has done some really brilliant work in this area. One of the things he's looked at, you mentioned PowerPoint. You might have noticed my PowerPoints are kind of bland and dry. Like there's a reason for that. Because all that other stuff distracts from learning. There's actually these 10 principles of multimedia presentations that are better for learning. And what Victor did, what's really interesting, is he went in and he got professors to agree to have them redo all their PowerPoints. And so they randomly assigned. One group got all their PowerPoints redone, and the other didn't. And all they did was go through and clean them up and make them, basically just text. Or if there's a picture, it was relevant to the matter at hand, right? You've ever seen somebody who does PowerPoint and there's all this other junk on there? Yeah. All that does is divide your attention. And they showed this huge increase in learning just by cleaning up PowerPoints. So I've been at this 20-some years, so I've been trying to go through and clean up. And every once in a while, I'll find a PowerPoint that I did in grad school when PowerPoint first came out, and there's one I have that has every stupid PowerPoint trick in the world, and I stand there and I laugh at the whole thing. I'm like, God, this is ridiculous. But then, of course, I forget to change it until the next year, and I'm standing there again. So that's one of the problems we face is people have invested so much time and effort in developing their classes that trying to get them to change even a little bit. I'm an innovator. I'm constantly trying to change stuff. My problem is I change too much.
Is there any study that shows how well they'll learn when they're studying with music or the TV or something?
Well, there's always, anytime you're dividing your attention, it's not necessarily a good thing. There's lots of work in that area. Music's one of those. Music's a very different thing. Um, Music actually can benefit learning.
I always learned that when I was studying that classic music is great to kind of
Yeah.
study with classic
That's
music.
because
But
people
right
have
now
this cultural
everybody's-
belief about classical music. It turns out almost any music is music. There's used to be this thing called the Mozart effect. It turns out the Mozart effect you can get with techno music and Charlie Chaplin.
I always found, maybe just me, but because there weren't words, like it was just jazz or
Right.
anything, it wouldn't distract me.
It really depends on.
So
Yeah.
it was words, so I listened to the words.
Yeah, I used to. So I have insane memory for music. Like music that from the 1970s country music will come on and I can sing the entire song from memory, and then I'm like, where is that kept? Can I not make room for something else more important?
Rapper's delight.
Yeah, it's like, why do I know that? But when I was an undergraduate, that was when the Joshua Tree album came out. And so I would listen to that, and then I could replay the music in my head, and I would remember my notes. But I don't know that anybody else can do it.
One of the things that we had that was taught in high school, I don't know if it's still being applied, showing how long ago it was, it probably is out, was that when you're trying something difficult, and you always did your homework at your desk,
Right.
you move to a different room and try to study it there so that when you came back, you could place yourself in that spot.
That comes out of Gestalt psychology. The sort of insight, this starting out of fresh. Sometimes it's just you just need a break.
Right.
And I think that's the important thing. The things I didn't touch on that I think are also important: sleep.
Yeah.
This is I lecture students about this all the time. I've started asking them the day of the exam how much sleep they've been getting. I'm kind of starting to find some interesting results. Exercise, another important thing. Study just came out. So I've been working with a colleague at Clemson on these fit desks called the Fit Desk. It's actually a bike that you can sit at and study at. And we haven't shown any real improvements in learning, but improvements in sleep quality and some other measures. So fortunately, students here are pretty active. It's DC, have to walk everywhere. I don't know if you've noticed. But fitness is important. The study that just came out that said vigorous exercise 4 hours after you studied something is the best time if you're trying to memorize something. And that has to do with this brain process called consolidation. And so there's some really interesting work being done there. One of my areas of expertise is drugs and human behavior. There's a whole new controversy over cognitive enhancing drugs in academia. So there's a drug called modafinil that has been shown to improve fluid intelligence. And so there's lots of questions about whether that's something people should do or not. It's really interesting. Adderall is, of course, the usual cognitive enhancer that is available on campuses, which is just amphetamines. It's not something I would recommend. So this studying is a lot like dieting. There are no shortcuts. You have to do it the hard way. And so I think that's the important thing. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I hope this is informative. My email, everything's on that first page. If you have questions, drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
Is this the same?
Yeah, it's all the same. It just got filed.
Is there anything to read in your notes right before you go to bed?
It doesn't hurt.
I just heard that that's a good way to put it into your memory as well.
So one of the things that happen, one of the reasons sleep is so important is you're consolidating. Dreams are actually, you're catching sort of glimpses of that process, which is why they never make any sense.
Thanks so much.
You bet, thank you. Your brain's busy consolidating everything. You bet, thank you. And so it doesn't hurt. There's actually a study that just came out that said if you study and then take a nap and then test, it's pretty good for you.
Sure. Thank you.
The other thing I tell students when I do this in classes is if they can take 15 minutes per class at the end of every day, they're a long way towards studying because then they're doing it every day. And it's only like it's an hour, so it's an easy thing to do.
Like I used to rewrite my notes.
That's sort of at the end of the day, if they can just spend 15 minutes per class going through their notes, filling in stuff they missed, looking at the book, and then every Sunday afternoon, go through the week. I think it's a really good way to
I'm also a college professor. The best
Okay.
student I ever had. That's exactly what she did.
Yeah.
She said every day she's
That's what I did. I worked full time.
she understood my courses better than I did.
Oh, yeah. I love those students. They keep you on your toes. Right.
Pretty interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Do you also give that notes to the students themselves? Is that information?
Yeah, I do. Very first day of intro psych. I do an actually longer version of this.
Okay. For all the students, only psychology.
When they take my class, yeah. I've also done So I did a longer version of this talk for the college council. About 70 students came to that. It's one of the reasons we started wanting to do this as part of orientation, is to try to get parents talking with their students. Yeah, so we're trying to. Sorry?
Oh, you're fine. You're totally fine.
Oh, totally fine. They gave us the smallest room they could find.
They don't like you.
Yeah. Well,
They say,
no one's going to want to listen to him talk.
no, they would say, we're giving this guy the smallest room.
But yes, I mean, I tried to do
Well, I was going to give it to you.
and that's why I started this YouTube channel. I was trying to do this major project. I try to give students as many resources. And so that talk, I think, is on my YouTube channel. So you can use it for students there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.